Carol and I have been married for 16 mostly wonderful years. We have a lovely 14-year-old daughter named Jenny. Initially, we wanted another child, but got involved with our jobs and were happy with Jenny. So, we decided against it. I love my family and thought we had a loving marriage and close relationship. I've always felt lucky to have an intelligent, attractive wife, but sometimes I wondered if having such a pretty wife would lead to some difficulty. I was always amazed that such a beautiful woman decided to marry an average-looking guy like me. Whenever I brought this up, Carol would laugh. "I guess I just felt sorry for you, Mark," she'd say. "You looked so dejected when I met you that first time. I just had to cheer you up." "Well, you sure did a great job at that," I'd reply. "After I met you, I've never felt dejected again. I love you." "I love you too, Mark." That teasing banter always got a big laugh from both of us. But lately, I've been thinking seriously about her answer. She was correct, you see, that I was depressed when Carol and I first met. I had just broken up with my longtime girlfriend from college. Yeah, I was dumped. I cared for her a lot. When she wanted to break up, I was very down in the dumps. We'd been together for 3 years, and the breakup hit me hard. I found out later she met another guy from her hometown and wanted to pursue a relationship with him. There was no cheating involved, and she always said she had fun with me when we were together. But she was soon leaving the area to return home and didn't want to maintain a long-distance relationship. She said they hadn't had closeness, but she was interested and decided to break up before cheating on me. I respected her for being honest, although it still hurt. Before I met Carol, I finished college with an accounting degree, got a job right away, and started my career as a single man. I dated a few girls, but never met anyone I really cared for. My love life was infrequent. None of the women from work turned me on. I partied with some friends after work, but my career was my life, and in a couple of years, I was making pretty good money. It was by chance that I met my future wife. I was invited to a friend's house for a party. My friend Jim Simpson, who I'd known since my college partying days, and his wife Martha kept trying to set me up with some eligible females. It was at one of these house parties that I met Carol. She was introduced to me at the party, and we hit it off. Carol's a tall, vivacious, natural blonde with a pretty face and a slender but shapely figure. Jim pointed her out and said she, like me, had broken up with her boyfriend and was available. She was so pretty that I found that hard to believe. Why would any guy in his right mind break up with a beautiful woman like her? Carol was pleasant and told me she was an art major and was graduating soon. She was not only beautiful and intelligent, but funny, outgoing, and very easy to talk to. We ended up chatting for most of the party. She agreed to meet me the next weekend, and we began dating. Soon we had closeness and became an item. Not long afterward, we were a couple. At first, Carol made it clear she was still dating other guys, but after a few months, we became exclusive. At least I was. It took her a little longer before I knew she had only eyes for me. I was already a CPA when I met Carol and established in my career. I think the fact that I was making good money and could afford to take Carol to places her previous boyfriends never could was a big factor in her decision to marry me. I know being financially stable was important to her, and when I showed her my new home, my sports car, and took her to nice restaurants, she was impressed. I'd like to think it was my good looks and charm that attracted her. But being honest, I knew that I was only average-looking and kind of reserved. Certainly not a stud. I believe she enjoyed our lovemaking. I know I did. I found out she was a lot more sexually experienced than I and had dated a lot of guys before me. In my mind, once we were married, it was forever, and those guys were history. She told me they were in her past, that she loved me and only me. I accepted her answer completely, and not long afterward, I asked her to marry me. When she said yes, it was the happiest day of my life. Jim Simpson had been a friend of mine for years. We played on a few sports teams and partied together. We lived in the same town and met up regularly to drink and hang out. Jim was married at the time, but when his marriage to Martha began to fail, I tried to help him get over his divorce. I found out later that he had been cheating on Martha, and she found out about it. She hired a shark of a lawyer and took my best friend to the cleaners. Jim's a handsome guy, loud and bigger than me. Once he was single and we went out together, I could see that women were attracted to him. He did date some really sexy chicks, even bringing them over to our house for parties and dinner. None of his relationships lasted longer than a few months. Carol and I talked about his problems, and she was the one that pushed me to keep inviting him over to our house. She kept telling me that Jim was down in the dumps about his life and needed our support. That didn't seem to fit, because I knew for a fact that he didn't need any help to get dates. Carol was insistent that we remain good friends and help him get over the bad memories of his divorce. I often told Carol she didn't need to worry about him so much. I didn't want to unfairly characterize my friend, so I never mentioned that he was a liar, a cheater, and probably deserved the divorce. I brought up that Jim was a good-looking single guy with a well-paying job, and told her how women seemed to flock to him everywhere we went. She disagreed. Carol said he was just hitting his depression about his failed marriage, that he was our friend, and we couldn't let him down. I guess I just went along with her opinion and kept up our friendship. He was my best friend for years, and the truth is, I was happy to have him around. That was the situation for a number of years. However, in the last few months, things began to change. As usual, Jim came around quite often, as had been the case for some time. But Carol increasingly kept bringing up his supposedly fragile emotional condition. It was strange because Jim didn't seem depressed at all. But she'd been like this for so long, I considered it a normal topic of conversation. However, when things grew even stranger around our house, I became suspicious. I was working harder than ever as an accountant. But over the last couple of years, my career had stagnated. I hadn't gotten the promotion I deserved. I still had a number of important clients and was still making decent money. And I was still providing for Carol, Jenny, and myself a good living. Carol was also working part-time at an art studio, making a small income. So our finances, while not improving much, were still on a sound footing. The problem was that after 10 years at my firm, I wasn't making the money I thought I should, considering the long hours I had to put in. I hoped for another raise to make up the shortfall. But when the economy took a downturn, upper management decided to have a series of layoffs. I kept my job, but my salary was cut. Luckily, Carol was still working, and our lifestyle at that time was pretty conservative. The problem arose when I told my wife we'd have to cut our expenses. When I informed her that we'd have to cancel our annual vacation, she was shocked. I explained the situation and told her that in addition to cutting our vacation, we'd have to cut back on a few other luxuries, such as going out so often. At the time, we usually went out every weekend to dinner, dancing, or to a show. Carol didn't understand why, after working so many years, our finances were in such a bad state. I went on to explain to my dubious spouse that my income had dropped and my prospects for a promotion in the short term were not good. Carol had always enjoyed an active social life. She had lots of friends, some of whom were rather snobby, and she loved to dress up and attend expensive social engagements. In the past, I reluctantly went along with her wishes when she'd accept invitations to some gala. But with my diminished income, the rather large mortgage, the car payments, and my responsibilities to our daughter's education fund, we had to cut back somewhere. Carol was not pleased when I informed her that we could no longer maintain our luxurious lifestyle. She was flabbergasted when I suggested canceling our visits to some of the expensive restaurants with her friends. Of course, that conversation led to an argument, and eventually a big fight over our future. At first, I didn't think it was unusual when my friend Jim was around during some of these arguments. He was coming over to our house several times a week at the time, so it was inevitable he'd witness some of these discussions. It was rather awkward when he seemed to favor Carol's side of the argument. He wasn't obvious about it. As Carol and I would discuss our issues, he'd listen for a bit, then offer an occasional comment that on the surface seemed conciliatory. But when I thought about it later, he seemed to always agree with Carol. When I brought up canceling outings with our friends, Carol turned to Jim and asked how he felt about it. The big guy would act thoughtful but eventually agree with Carol. He would reiterate her arguments and even offer to help us out with our finances if needed. I didn't like that answer. He went on to offer to drive if we wanted to go out somewhere. If Carol and I wanted to go to a club that had a cover charge, Jim even offered to pay whatever fee was required. If we were invited to a party, he'd pay for some sort of gift if necessary, so we wouldn't have to go empty-handed. I thanked him, but said no thanks. I wanted to make my wife happy, but I was irritated that he always offered to come to our financial rescue. I knew he could afford to help us out. He had left his previous job and was now working in some sales job, apparently doing quite well. One evening, Carol invited Jim over for dinner without telling me, which happened quite regularly now. As usual, she was a great hostess. We enjoyed a pleasant conversation as we finished the delicious dinner Carol cooked. After our daughter left to do her homework, we retired to the living room and opened a bottle of wine. We barely poured our wine and sat down before Carol reminded me of the upcoming annual charity event. I'd forgotten about it, although it was something we went to every year. I listened to her talk about how many of our friends would be there and how nice the event was. I already knew about this event and also how much it would cost to get in. When I explained that we couldn't afford any sort of party this month, Jim suddenly spoke up. He said he understood my reluctance, but that this event was for charity, and it would be a shame not to contribute in some way. Carol eagerly listened to him with a look of delight on her face. When my friend offered to assist us with the cost, Carol was elated. I, however, was pissed. He was well aware of our financial situation and my feelings on the subject. I guess I expected my best friend to support my decision, but that wasn't the case. Carol listened silently to my objections. Then she shot me a glare and glanced over at Jim. They shared a look that immediately raised my suspicions. "Come on, Mark," Jim said pointedly. "You know this is an annual event and one that we've never missed. It'd be a shame not to go over just a few bucks." "We've been going for years," I replied. I was also disappointed, but I knew that we needed to keep our expenses down so we could afford the large mortgage payment that month. "We just have to go, sweetheart," Carol insisted, patting my hand. "I know it will be a little tight, but everyone we know will be there." Jim chipped in. "You know the guys would love to see you, Mark. I know they're all looking forward to it. It'll be a blast." Before I could reply, Carol squealed, "We had so much fun last year, remember, honey?" I shook my head no, and Carol scowled. With a determined glare, she said, "I'm serious, Mark. We have to go, honey. All our friends will be there, and I've already spoken to Mary and Gwen. I don't want them to think that we don't contribute to charity. Everyone wants to give to charity. But I was thinking that if we don't get our finances together, we'll be the ones that have to accept charity. It's just not in the budget this year," I told them flat out. "Maybe next year." "But it'll be a blast," Jim said, smiling. "Of course it will," Carol said. She pouted and turned to Jim. "But darn it, Mark just doesn't want to go." Jim questioned my decision again. Before I could answer, my wife began to complain about how cheap I was. Nothing she said was a secret. I'd been holding back on some of our expenditures. She turned her attention to Jim and listed several times she couldn't do what she wanted because I refused. "You see, Jim," she said to him, ignoring me, "I'm trying to enjoy a great social life, but Mark's not letting me. He's getting cheap in his old age." Carol made me sound like a disagreeable old man. I tried to reply calmly, but it was difficult. "I'm not cheap, Carol, just realistic. Despite what you think, we're in a bit of a slump. Spending money we don't have is just stupid. In our situation, I don't want us to overextend ourselves." "But think of all the good that we can contribute, honey," Jim quickly added. "You know it's a charity event, right, Mark?" "Of course I do," I exclaimed in exasperation. "But it's $75 a plate. Then there's the parking fee at the club. And after an expensive dinner that we can't afford, there's the charity auction. We'll be expected to bid on overpriced items that we'll never use. Charity or not, we can't afford it." That led to an acrimonious discussion about my diminished position at work and my reduced salary. Jim already knew some of it, but they were sensitive issues I wanted to remain private because I was rather embarrassed about it. Carol smelled blood and was really venting now. She complained openly to Jim about her disappointment with me and frustrations with her lifestyle. I didn't want her to divulge any of that stuff, but it was too late. I admitted we had to cut back expenses to make sure Jenny's education was taken care of, and we could make our mortgage payments. I hoped that would put some sense of reality into my wife, but she was unsympathetic. "See what I mean?" Carol sneered, gazing hopefully at Jim. "He always comes up with some dumb excuse not to go out." I was pissed. These two were openly ganging up on me, countering my arguments and totally dismissing my concerns. Carol was gazing hopefully at Jim, waiting for him to say something to support her. Jim glanced at her and then looked at me with a sympathetic look. "Well, Mark, why don't I cover you then?" he quickly offered. "I don't want to go by myself and I have the cash. It's not a problem. It'd be my pleasure to take you and Carol out to this event. You know we always have fun. I'd be disappointed if you weren't there. After all, you've been there for me for the past year after my divorce. So in a way, I'll be paying you back. I'd love to take you both to keep me company. I'll drive and even pay for the babysitter, too." "Really?" Carol squealed, elated that someone was coming to her rescue. "Oh gosh, Jim, that's wonderful. Thank you so much." Before I could reject his offer, she ran around the table, hugged the guy, and kissed him, crying repeatedly, "Thank you, Jim. Thank you." I was steaming, not just about Jim contradicting my decision, but also about Carol's gleeful reaction to his offer. She cared nothing about my opinion and practically threw herself at him. Right now, she was gushing openly like he was her savior. I shot Jim a look of disapproval as Carol continued to hug him. Carol squealed and Jim bashfully accepted her praise while I sat across the table feeling angry and disgusted. Despite what Carol said, I had no intention of accepting anyone's charity, even if it was from a friend. I was most put off by Carol's exuberant physical response. By now, Jim had his arm around her waist as she kissed his cheek and hugged him warmly. In no uncertain terms, I quickly rejected his offer. My pride wouldn't let me accept a handout from anybody. They stopped hugging, and Carol considered me coolly. "Come on, Mark," Jim said. "Don't be upset." Noticing my dark expression, he told me with a smile, "Let's just go to that thing and have some fun. We can worry about the money later." "No way, damn you. I'm serious about this," Carol declared. "Oh, just be quiet, Mark. You can pout about this all you want, but we're going, and that's final." "We'll see about that." She looked at me like I was crazy. She got a weird look on her face, shook her head, and pulled away from Jim's embrace. Then she trotted to the kitchen, grabbed her cell phone, and called up one of her friends. With Carol in the other room, Jim and I sat there in silence. I glared at him across the table, as we both heard my wife in the other room chattering away. He looked a little uncomfortable as Carol chatted giddily with her friend. "Oh, yes, we're going. I told you we would," she cried into the phone. "Oh, yeah, I know. Well, not really, but I told you we were going. I know what you thought, girl, but you knew Jim would come through for us. He's been such a good friend." "No, I don't think so. But you know how we can—" Her voice suddenly slipped to a lower volume to where I couldn't hear her anymore. Then Carol peeked into the living room and glanced over at me with a smug look. She spoke quietly into the phone as she headed back into the other room for privacy. After that confrontation, the friendship Jim and I shared was broken. I thought as my buddy he would have taken my side, but he didn't seem to be bothered about ignoring me. He tried a few times to explain that he just wanted Carol and me to have a good time, so I should just accept it. In my mind, he had taken sides, and it wasn't with me. A while later, my wife came back into the room with a huge smile on her face. She once again thanked Jim, hugging him and kissing his cheek. It seemed a bit over the top to me when she didn't seem to want to leave his embrace. I told them again that we're not going, and that was my decision. Jim tried to intervene, and Carol kept hugging him, informing me that she was going and wouldn't hear of it. I kept shaking my head, but both Jim and my wife weren't listening. They seemed determined to use the time before the event to get me to change my mind. Looking back, that argument may have been the beginning of the end of my once happy marriage. The week before the charity event was frosty in our house. Even our daughter Jenny noticed the deep freeze. She was 14, but she wasn't stupid. She knew about the charity event and knew there was a simmering issue between Carol and me that wasn't being resolved. "What's the matter, Dad?" she asked one day when Carol was out of the room. "I know that you and Mom are arguing about something. She wants to accept charity and I don't want to." "Charity? You mean welfare or something?" "Not exactly, but it might as well be welfare," I told her. "I wasn't brought up to depend on anyone. It's a matter of pride, darling. Once you start taking money from people, it's hard to stop. I've never accepted charity in my life and don't intend on starting now." "It's about that charity event, isn't it?" "Yes, we simply can't afford it, Jenny. I'm not taking a handout just to put on a big show for our friends." "But Mom said it's from Uncle Jimmy," she replied, studying my reaction. "He's your friend, isn't he?" "I'm sure he doesn't think it's charity. Just one friend helping another." "Is that how your mother sees it?" Jenny lowered her eyes. "Well, we spoke about it. A little." That wasn't any surprise. Carol was pleading her case to get Jenny on her side behind my back. Knowing my clever wife was using my daughter to influence me pissed me off. "I'm sure your mom has told you all about it then," I said, holding my temper. "But no matter if it's from a friend or not, it's still charity. I don't want to raise you thinking that we are that hard up. My dad never accepted charity his whole life, and he had more problems than we do." "But Dad, it's just a party. It's not like we're accepting cash, you know? And Uncle Jimmy is our friend." I was getting annoyed that she kept referring to Uncle Jimmy. I guess that's how Carol must refer to him when I'm not around. I answered my daughter with a little more anger than I should have. "If your Uncle Jimmy," I sneered, accentuating his label, "was really my friend, he'd keep his big mouth shut, his nose out of my affairs, and leave my family alone." My bitter reply caught Jenny off guard, and she drew back, looking scared. Then she ran up to her room and closed her door. I felt bad for speaking so bluntly, but I was sick of hearing about Uncle Jimmy and his gratuity. I needed my family to support my decision, although it seemed that wasn't the case. Each day, Carol kept smirking at me. I kept insisting that we weren't going to any charity event, with or without Jim's help. Each time we had that discussion, she shot me a dark look, and we had another argument. A few days before the event, Carol addressed me with undisguised aggravation. "Listen, Mark," she said, I don't know why you got your panties in such a bunch about this. You know we go to this event every year, and I don't intend to miss it this year, despite your problems at work. I know we're having a little financial difficulty right now. I get it, but we're certainly not poor, and we still need to keep up appearances. If we don't attend, all my friends will be aware of our problems. They'll be talking about us, about me, and I don't want to hear the gossip about it later. Jim has offered to help us out, and if you're the man I thought I married, you will accept it with a smile. So that's it, I blurted out angrily. I'm not man enough now? Oh crap, Mark. Will you just stop? Of course you are. Just grow up. Then it's all about the gossip. Not all about it, but yes, I want our family to look good, and I do want to be considered a valued member of our social group. We have made a lot of friends over the years, and I want to go have an enjoyable evening with them. Don't you want to be seen with me? That's not fair, and you know it. Of course, I want to be seen with you. I love you and always have. But this argument has gotten me quite pissed off. I thought you would support your husband as a good wife should, and try to understand our situation. I can see that's not the case. So if you want to disrespect me this much, just go without me. You asshole, she cried angrily. You think I'm not a good wife? That's a bunch of crap, and you know it. For 16 years, I've taken care of you and Jenny without so much as a complaint. Lord knows I could have complained about a lot of things, but haven't. Like what, damn it? She gazed at me with an icy glare. For a moment, she didn't speak. The silence was deafening as I waited her out. So you're going to be mad about this, are you? She said bitterly. I thought I could convince you that it would be good for us to have a night out together. Lord knows that hasn't happened lately. You haven't taken me out on a real date in months, and I'm sick of it. That's a lie. We go out to dinner as a family every week. We also go out dancing occasionally. Just not to those posh, expensive joints you're hooked on. I told you, Carol, we can't afford that right now. Once Jenny's education is taken care of, I'm sure things will loosen up. Carol looked like she'd bitten into a lemon as she listened to me. She seemed to come to a decision and suddenly calmed down. But the triumphant look on her face was troubling. Some idea of a husband. If you aren't going to give me this one night out, then I guess I'll have to be Jim's date. I'm sure he'll be proud to have me, even if you aren't. And don't think it's going to be a platonic date either. I'm going to give your buddy all the attention that I would have given you, and I know he's going to appreciate it. You witch! I snapped with more anger than I'd felt in a while. I should have known you had this in your head. Don't let me stop you then. Go out with him, but don't think I'll forget this sordid betrayal, and I won't forget Uncle Jim's part in this either. I stomped out of the room and slammed the door as she yelled, You a-hole! I'm going, damn it! Well, that didn't go well at all. As I stomped away, I passed by the living room. Jenny was watching TV. I know she heard the whole argument when she glanced over at me with a frightened look. I wanted to hug and console her to soothe her fears, but I was too worked up at my stubborn wife to say anything nice. So I just went out on the patio and sat in a chair, steaming. The day before the charity event found our house bitterly cold. Jim called me a few times during the week to convince me to change my mind. I wasn't having it, and the last time I just hung up on him. Our finances were shaky enough, and we simply had to cut back. I had to face facts to keep our family secure, even if my wife wouldn't. If she wanted to make an issue about this, then she was going to get her wish. The night of the event, I'm sure Carol fixed dinner, but I made it a point to stay away and eat out at some cheap place that night. I got home after Jenny and my wife finished eating. I mumbled some greeting and Jenny said, Hi, Dad. Carol didn't speak to me. She simply went into the bedroom and locked the door as she got ready for her date with Jim. To keep me from causing a scene, Carol decided to drive over to Jim's house and leave from there. When she came downstairs to leave, she made sure to strut around the living room, displaying her sexy attire. If I wasn't pissed off before, I was livid now. She had on a short, tight aqua dress I'd never seen before. It was shockingly brief and displayed her curves like it was painted onto her slender body. Her long hair was flowing, her makeup was fixed, and the high heels she had on made her shapely legs look great. The charity event wasn't that high class, so I was astonished to see her so dressed up. Where'd you get that dress? Don't worry about it. Where'd she get the money to buy such an obviously expensive dress? But she wasn't going to tell me, so I kept quiet. Carol ignored me as she went to where Jenny was sitting in front of the TV, leaned down, and gave our daughter a kiss. Well, you look wonderful, Mom. You look like a movie star in that dress. Thanks, dear. Carol's smile disappeared as she glanced pointedly over at me. She told Jenny loud enough for me to hear, I know Uncle Jim will think so too. I just wish everybody felt the same way. Of course, that comment was directed at me, and I was furious. Unlike when we went out, Carol never looked as good on any of our dates. But for Uncle Jim, she went all out. I could see this was going to be an issue. I just looked at her with disgust and walked out of the room. I wanted her to know I was angry, and she definitely knew it. "Goodbye, Jenny," Carol said, walking to the door, speaking to my daughter and ignoring me. "I may be out late, honey, so don't wait up." She walked out the door and didn't look back. Jenny saw my dismal look and shot me a look of pure pity, which again pissed me off. I knew she hated being in the middle of this, and I wasn't happy either. Something about my daughter pitying me made me even angrier. I marched to the den and shot off a quick text to my former best friend. "I thought we were friends, Jim. Now that you're dating my wife, I know you're just another sleazy a-hole. After tonight, don't bother contacting me and don't consider yourself my friend. You're not welcome here ever again. Have a good time with my witch of a wife, you prick." I quickly got one back. "It's not a date, Mark, and you know it. I wanted you to come, but you're too stubborn. I'm just letting Carol have some fun, and then I'll make sure she gets home safe. We'll have to talk later. Please don't be upset with me." I sent back, "Screw you, craphead." I didn't hear back. I tried to keep my mind off my wife, but it was impossible. Jenny and I watched TV for a while and tried to converse like nothing was wrong. I don't even know what we watched. She could tell I was upset. To her credit, Jenny spoke kindly to me and tried to make me feel better. I was pleased about that, but it wasn't going to be a good night, and we both knew it. Around 10, Jenny went to bed. It was early for her, and the situation was so awkward, I guess she couldn't take the tension. I could hear her talking on her cell phone with somebody when I went to bed. Somehow, I managed to sleep, but I was woken up by the noise of the front door closing. I glanced at the clock and saw it was 2:30 in the morning. I could hear voices downstairs and knew it was my wife and my former friend. I rolled out of bed and glanced into the living room. They were still near the front door, and it was clear Carol was sloppy drunk. So drunk and unstable she was hanging onto Jim's arm for support. Her hair was messed up, her eyes were droopy, and she was swaying and giggling. "Thank you for such a wonderful time tonight, Jimmy," she laughed, slurring her words and hugging him close. She threw her arms around his neck, pressed her lean body against his, and gave him a steamy kiss on the lips. It lasted far longer than was proper, and Carol didn't seem like she wanted it to end. Finally, Jim pulled back and glanced around tentatively. "It was fun, but it's late, and you should get to bed now, Carol." "But I don't want to. Go to bed. Mark might be worried about you." "Screw him," she sneered with a giggle. "He's a wet blanket, and I had so much fun with you tonight. Let's do it again, okay?" I was at the top of the stairs where they couldn't see me. Jim looked uneasy as he glanced toward the hallway. He knew where our bedroom was located. He couldn't see me, but he was probably wondering if I was listening to them. "Let's not talk about that now," he told her. "Go get a shower, get some sleep, and try to make up with your husband." "Screw that a-hole," she slurred and again fell into his arms. "Why don't you stay and have a drink with me?" "It's not that late, honey." "No, I don't think that's such a great idea." "Oh, come on," she murmured, and pulled his head down for a kiss. This time, Carol French kissed him for a bit before he pushed her away. "Please, Carol." "I'm trying to keep us out of trouble," he chuckled. "You're making that real hard right now?" I was already pissed, but I was dumbfounded when I saw her hand move between them and clutch his tool through his trousers. "I can tell you're hard and big, too," she giggled merrily. "In fact, I've known you were quite big every time we danced together. Come on, don't go yet." Jim was smirking but pulled her hand off his tool and said, "You better stop." "Come on, Jim. I can tell you want to stay. Let's go to the sofa and let me show you how much I appreciate all the attention you showed me tonight." "No, I'm serious, Carol," Jim said, looking more worried. "I know you're a beautiful woman, and I'm horny, sure, but I don't want to cause any more trouble with Mark. We are friends, you know. And you're my friend, too," Carol slurred with her hand back on his crotch. "Mark's asleep, and he doesn't give a crap about me. I want you to be my special friend, Jim. Please come and stay for a little while." I couldn't take any more of this crap. I stepped into the room with a look of hate on my face. "Yeah, Jim," I said curtly, startling them both. "Why don't you be Carol's special friend, you a-hole?" Jim and Carol both jumped at my presence. In a sarcastic tone, I continued, "Why don't you stay for a little while and screw my cheap, drunk 403 of a wife? After such a nice date, I'm sure she'll love that." Jim's eyes widened and his face fell. He pushed my wife away and Carol gazed at me with bloodshot eyes, trying to focus. It took a moment for her to regain her composure and sober up a little. Listen, Mark, Jim started to say. No, you listen, you crap face. I can see now just how much of a special friend you were to my wife. So just screw her. Take her over to the sofa and give the filthy 403 what she wants. Jim shook his head sadly and turned to leave. Carol cried, no, grabbed his arm and pulled him back. Just shut up, Mark. Jim was nice to me all night and he doesn't deserve this. Then give him what he deserves, witch, I cried. You want his big hard meat, so go for it, you cheating 403. Damn you, a-hole, Carol screamed. Her face was red as a beet. Jim just wanted to crawl in a hole. Listen, Mark, Jim said apologetically. I know you're upset about tonight and all, but we did have a great time and nothing happened. I have your word on that, right, craphead? I sneered. I'm sure I can trust you. Yeah, nothing happened. I know this looks bad. Why, Uncle Jim? I asked angrily. Why does it look bad? Because my 403 is trying to give you a job and maybe a job for being so nice. Or because she's taking you over to the sofa to enjoy Zex. Is that it, Uncle Jim? Jim looked at Carol, then at me. He shook his head and headed for the front door to make his escape. On the way, he said to me, no, Mark, listen, I gotta go. He told my drunk wife, I better go now, Carol. I'll help you get your car later if you want. I think he was going to say more, but saw my glare. Instead, he twisted away from Carol's grasp and hustled out the front door. As it closed behind him, Carol seemed to deflate. She looked drunk and dejected as she stumbled into the kitchen to get some water, probably to sober up. I left her there by herself and trudged back to bed. My marriage was no longer on solid ground. Carol woke up on the sofa. She never made it upstairs, and I found her lying there the next morning, sprawled out in her new dress. I tried to hold in my anger as I helped her up to the bedroom and flopped her onto the bed. I didn't undress her and left her lying in that tight, obviously expensive aqua dress. I did take off her high heels and pulled a cover over her. Carol slept until the late afternoon, painfully hungover, and I could understand why after watching her drunken performance last night. I was angry as hell that she just threw herself at Jim, but decided not to act like I was. I wanted to see how she would play it before tipping my hand. I knew our relationship had been off for quite a while. The argument about the charity event was just the latest disagreement. It was, however, the biggest argument we had ever had. Carol finally made it up for dinner and looked like crap. We didn't speak because she didn't want to. I just kept silent, determined to make her bring up her disgusting behavior. She slept in the guest room, and the rest of the weekend, we tiptoed around each other. She was so drunk, I'm not sure Carol even remembered much about that night. She's not a drinker, so whatever she consumed that night probably had her nearly blacking out. Saturday morning, I made Jenny and myself breakfast. She mentioned Carol coming home with Jim and asked what the argument was about. I didn't offer much of an explanation, just that we're still working through the charity event issue. Jenny accepted that vague explanation and left the house early. She told me she was going to go over to a friend's house. I told her to call in a few hours to check in. I went to work Monday as usual. Carol took a while to recover and didn't go to work until Wednesday. We didn't speak about that night until the middle of the next week. I think it took her that long to clear her head from all the alcohol she drank. She acted embarrassed when she tried to apologize for her behavior. I was still too angry to accept any apology. I let her tell me that she was sorry, then spun around and left her standing there. That pissed her off, but I didn't care anymore. Jim called me a couple of times. I ignored his calls and let them go to voicemail. I listened as he apologized about how that night turned out and that he wanted to talk about it. He wanted to meet me, but I never responded. I'm sure he wanted to soften the guilt he felt for betraying me. I didn't give a crap about him anymore. As far as I was concerned, our friendship was over. One evening, when I was out washing the car, I went inside for something and heard Carol speaking on the phone in the kitchen. She didn't know I was there, so I tried to listen to her conversation. Yes, it was wonderful, she told whoever she was speaking to. I know he's still pissed at me. Ha ha, you're so what? Thanks. No, Mark didn't get it. It was Jim that bought it for me. Yeah, I know. It cost a fortune. He's such a sweetheart and so handsome. I would have. Ha ha. But Mark woke up as I was trying to get him to. Yeah, I know. Mark saw me trying to get him. And yes, I know. Yeah, ha ha ha. Oh, it sure was not only big, but hard too. Real hard. My wife was talking to one of her girlfriends about Jim's meat. Oh, Mark would have a fit if he knew that. No, you can't tell him. No, ha ha. I have to keep that quiet. I hope he does. We're trying to figure out when. I know, but I have to be careful. Mark doesn't know. You know he called me. He's been calling me all week. I don't know if I can. Of course I want to. Who wouldn't want to date with a guy like Jim? You better not. I'm serious. Okay, I know. She chatted a little more, but I'd heard enough. I was almost sure she was going to date my ex-friend. I could hardly believe how much our marriage had crumbled in the last few weeks. I caught Carol on the phone a couple more times. Whenever I entered the room, she'd either turn away and speak softly or simply hang up. On the weekend, Jim suddenly showed up at our house in his big SUV. I was in the driveway fiddling with my car when he pulled in front of the driveway. He got out of his big car and strode up our walk smiling as if everything was fine. Carol must have known he was coming because the second he got out, she immediately came outside with a weird smile on her face. We hadn't been speaking, so when she approached me and began to speak to me, I was immediately on my guard. "Hi, honey. I invited Jim over for dinner," she told me flat out. When I started to object, she held up her hand to stop me. "Listen, Mark, I know what you're going to say. You're still upset about that night, but I think that you two need to talk. Jim wants to. We need to get over this and get back to being friends again." Jim was a few feet away and smiled as he approached. "Hi, Mark," he said good-naturedly, holding out his hand. "Nice to see you again, buddy." I just stared at that idiot with a cold look. Trying to diffuse the situation, Carol moved next to me with a sweet smile and slipped her arm around my waist. She whispered, "Go on, honey," with a big smile as she tried to coax me forward to shake his hand. I just let it hang there in the air and ignored it. Jim's smile disappeared as he realized the insult and lowered his hand. Next to me, my wife tried to soften the tense atmosphere. "Hi, Jim," she gushed, ignoring my harsh glare. "Nice to see you. I'm glad you came over today. I was just telling Mark it was time to clear the air and—" "Screw you," I snapped. Carol was startled. Her bright smile wilted a bit. "Please, Mark," Jim said. "I know you're still upset, but—" "Oh, you got that, did you?" I felt my wife's arm tighten around my waist. She stumbled against me, trying to keep me from getting any angrier. "Please, honey," Carol purred, pressing my arm against her breast. She tried to kiss my cheek. "Don't be mad at him. It's my fault what happened, not his. Jim's been your friend for so long, and I know you miss him. He misses you too, right, Jim?" "That's right," Jim quipped. "Come on, Mark. No hard feelings, right, buddy?" I shot him a look that could kill. Then I twisted out of Carol's grasp. I looked straight into his eyes, wishing I could shoot this creep. "So tell me, buddy, did you have a good time with my wife at the charity event?" "Well, yeah, of course we did," Carol chirped. "We wanted you to come, Mark. It would have been more fun if you were there, honey. You would have loved it." She hadn't spoken to me in nearly a week, and now she was acting all sweet and innocent. I didn't believe her for a second. Jim gazed at me tentatively, and I looked right back in his eyes. "So, did you guys dance together?" I asked him. "Huh? Well, yeah. Everyone was dancing and all. Of course." Carol moved next to me again and slipped her arm around me. With a sugary, sweet smile frozen on her face, she said, "Of course we danced, Mark. Everyone was dancing and having a great time. Like I said, you would have loved it if you had come." I ignored my wife's irritating chatter and kept my attention on Jim. "So you danced, huh? Did you dance the slow songs, Jim, old buddy? Hold Carol in your arms? Feel her tits against your chest in that skimpy dress she had on?" His face twisted into a strange grimace. He was uncomfortable, perplexed by these probing questions. "No, nothing like that, Mark," he replied innocently. "Just, dancing and having a good time. Nothing inappropriate." I glared at his face for a moment longer. Then I pushed Carol away, so she was next to him, and turned my attention to her. "And you, my dear, honest wife," I sneered. "Was it all just some casual, friendly dancing like Jim said? Just two friends engaged in some platonic activity. Nothing inappropriate, right?" "Of course not, Mark," she blustered. "I'd never do anything to disrespect you, honey. You know that." I pulled out my cell phone and opened up a picture. A guy I knew was at the event with his wife. At my request, he sent me a few incriminating photos of my wife and the a-hole. I turned the phone so Carol could see it. It took my wife a moment to realize it was her and Jim dancing close at the charity event. Suddenly, the blood drained from her face, and her eyes bugged out. "So my faithful wife dancing like this with my dear old friend is just some platonic dancing, right, honey?" I snickered sarcastically as she gazed at the phone. Jim moved closer so he could see, and his face went dark. "Where did you get this?" he asked. It was a side shot of Carol and Jim on the dance floor. Couples were dancing all around them. Some were glancing with amusement at my wife and my former friend engaged in an intimate embrace. Jim's taller than me, and he towered over Carol. That didn't stop her from sliding her arms around his neck, pressing her lithe body against his, and Jim leaning down to kiss her on the lips. It was a still shot, so there was no way to know how long the kiss lasted. But to someone who didn't know them, it was very incriminating. Carol's face blanched as she saw how intimate their embrace was, not to mention the kiss. I heard Jim gulp, "Oh boy." I flipped to another picture and asked, "Carol, my dear, I guess you enjoyed the kiss by how you were gazing up into his eyes?" The next shot was closer, with only their upper bodies in view. Jim's hands were placed around her waist, and Carol was gazing up at him with adoration in her eyes. A couple next to them was watching with smiles on their faces. I flipped to another picture, and this one had them sitting in a booth. Jim's arm was around her shoulders, his hand hovering over her breast. Carol was leaning against his shoulder, her face turned up to his as if expecting another kiss. The last was a shot of them outside on a patio. They were hugging, with Carol making no effort to pull away. Jim was whispering something in her ear, and she was smiling up at him. The expressions on their faces were intimate, and the body language was clear. Carol's face turned beet red. "It's not what it looks like, Mark. I swear." Jim stepped back, looking embarrassed and uncomfortable. "Mark, I know this looks bad, but I promise nothing happened." Jim stepped back, looking embarrassed and uncomfortable. "Mark, I know this looks bad, but I promise nothing happened." I felt a white-hot fury boil over inside me, threatening to consume my every thought. The man I had considered my best friend standing there making feeble excuses while my wife, stood beside him, her face a mixture of guilt and defiance. I had reached my breaking point. "You promise nothing happened?" I repeated, my voice dangerously low. "You expect me to believe that after everything I've seen and heard?" Carol tried to step forward, her hand outstretched in a placating gesture. "Mark, please, let's just sit down and talk about this. We can—" "Shut up!" I roared, my voice echoing through the house. "I've heard enough of your lies!" I stormed to the drawer in the living room, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and adrenaline. I yanked it open and pulled out the old Magnum .44 that had been sitting there, forgotten for years. My fingers wrapped around the cold steel, the weight of it both grounding and terrifying. "Mark, what are you doing?" Carol's voice was a whisper, her eyes wide with fear as she took a step back. "Get on your knees," I commanded, my voice icy. "Both of you, now!" Jim's face turned ashen. "Mark, this isn't necessary. We can talk." "I said get on your knees," I shouted, pointing the Magnum at him. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a war drum. Slowly, reluctantly, they both dropped to their knees, their eyes never leaving the Magnum in my hand. "Now," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You're going to tell me everything, every single detail. And if you lie to me, so help me God, I will shoot you both." Carol started to cry, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Jim looked at her, then back at me, his eyes pleading. "Mark, it was just one night," Jim began, his voice shaking. "We were both drunk. It didn't mean anything." "One night?" I sneered. "You think that makes it better? Tell me everything. Now." Jim swallowed hard. "It started a few months ago. Carol was upset about the financial situation, and I guess I took advantage of that. We met a few times, just to talk at first, but then..." "Then what?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the Magnum. "We kissed," Carol whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was at one of the parties. I don't even know how it happened, but it did. And then we met up a few times after that." "How many times?" I asked, my voice cold. "3, she admitted, her eyes filled with tears. "I swear, Mark, it didn't mean anything. I was just so lonely and angry, and Jim was there." Jim looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Mark. I never meant for it to go this far." I felt a cold, dark satisfaction at their confessions, but it did nothing to quell the storm inside me. I wanted to scare them, to make them feel the betrayal I had felt. But then, everything changed in an instant. Jim, perhaps thinking he could disarm me, suddenly stood up and lunged at me. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. Instinctively, I pulled the trigger. The Magnum was deafening in the confined space. Jim's body jerked violently, and he collapsed to the floor. Carol screamed, a sound that would haunt me forever. I stood there, staring at Jim's lifeless body, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I hadn't meant to kill him. I just wanted to scare them, to make them confess. But now, it was too late. Panic set in. I had to get out of there. I couldn't face the consequences of what I had done. I turned to Carol, who was still sobbing hysterically. "Get up!" I ordered, my voice hollow. Get up and go to the bathroom. She looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. Mark, please! Do it! I shouted, and she scrambled to her feet, running to the bathroom. I followed her, my mind racing. I shoved her inside and quickly found some rope. I tied her hands and feet, ensuring she couldn't move or call for help, then locked the door, pocketing the key. She had no cell phone, nothing to contact anyone. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was the only thing keeping me moving. My fear was a living thing, clawing at my insides, but my anger was stronger. The humiliation of being betrayed by my best friend and my wife fueled my actions. I knew what I was doing was dangerous, but I couldn't stop now. I had to escape. I ran back to the living room, my heart pounding. Jim's body lay there, a stark reminder of my irreversible mistake. I couldn't stay here. I had to run. Grabbing the Magnum, I hurried to the car and jumped in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and peeled out of the driveway. I had only a few hours to reach the border. I knew I had to move fast. As I drove, I called my sister, who lived about an hour away. I needed to make sure Jenny was safe and out of the house before the police arrived. Hey, sis, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need a huge favor. Mark, what's wrong? You sound off. Can you take Jenny for a day? Something came up and I can't explain right now. It's really important. Of course, but please just do this for me. I'll explain everything later. Just pick her up as soon as you can. All right, Mark, I'll be there in an hour. I hung up, my heart breaking at the thought of what I was about to do. I called Jenny next. Hey, Dad, she answered, her voice cheerful. What's up? Jenny, I said, my voice breaking. I need you to know that I love you, more than anything in this world. Whatever happens, remember that. Dad, what's wrong? You sound weird. I have to go away for a while, I said, tears streaming down my face. I can't explain now, but know that I love you and I'm doing this for you. Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on? Just promise me you'll be strong, Jenny. I have to go. Goodbye. I hung up, my heart breaking at the thought of leaving her behind, but I had no choice. I had to disappear. I drove through the night, my mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. The adrenaline was still pumping, helping me focus on the task at hand. The consequences of my actions were too severe to dwell on now. I needed to escape. Just before reaching the border, I pulled over to the side of the road. I knew I couldn't risk being caught with the Magnum. I found a secluded spot and buried it deep in the dirt, covering my tracks as best as I could. Satisfied, I got back in the car and continued towards the border. By the time I reached the Mexican border, dawn was breaking. I knew this was my last chance to cross undetected. With a deep breath, I drove through the checkpoint, praying they wouldn't stop me. Luck was on my side. I made it through without incident. Once I was in Mexico, I ditched the car, ensuring there were no traces left. I then found a payphone and made an anonymous call to the police, informing them about the situation at my house. My heart pounded as I spoke, knowing this call was the final tie to my old life. I traveled further south, using what little cash I had to stay under the radar. For the first few months, I lived in a state of constant paranoia. Every siren, every police officer, every unfamiliar face sent my heart racing. I moved from town to town, never staying in one place for too long. The fear of being caught was my constant companion, and I knew I had to stay vigilant. I adopted a new identity, becoming Carlos Alvarez, a quiet, unassuming man who kept to himself. I found work where I could, doing odd jobs and manual labor, anything that would keep me under the radar. My once comfortable life was now a distant memory, replaced by a harsh, uncertain existence. Despite the hardships, there were moments of peace. The beauty of the Mexican countryside provided a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. I found solace in the simple things: a warm meal, a friendly smile, the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore. But the guilt never left me. It gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the life I had destroyed. I thought of Jenny every day, wondering how she was coping without me. I missed her more than I could bear, but I knew I could never go back. One day, while working at a small cantina in a coastal village, I saw a familiar face on the television screen behind the bar. My heart stopped as I realized it was me. The news report detailed the events of that fateful night, the manhunt that had followed, and the ongoing search for Mark Davis, the fugitive wanted for elimination. The bartender noticed my reaction and turned up the volume. I listened in horror as they described the scene of the crime, the evidence they had found, and the police's determination to bring me to justice. They showed photos of Jenny and Carol, urging anyone with information to come forward. I couldn't stay there any longer. I thanked the bartender, left a generous tip, and walked out into the bright sunlight, my mind racing. I had to keep moving. I couldn't afford to let my guard down. Over the next few years, I drifted from place to place, always looking over my shoulder. I changed my appearance, growing a beard and dyeing my hair. I learned to speak Spanish fluently, blending in with the locals as best I could. I made a few friends, but I never let anyone get too close. I found work in construction, fishing, and even as a handyman in a small resort town. The physical labor was grueling, but it kept me busy and gave me little time to dwell on my past. I sent money anonymously to Jenny whenever I could, hoping it would help her in some small way. A year after my escape, I decided to risk contacting Jenny. I had to know how she was, even if it was just for a moment. I found a secluded payphone and dialed the number, my heart pounding. "Hello?" Her voice was the same, yet different, older, more strained. "Jenny, it's me," I said, my voice trembling. "It's Dad." "Dad?" Her tone shifted instantly to anger. "Why did you do it? Why did you leave us?" "Jenny, I didn't have a choice. I had to go. I was protecting you." "Protecting me? You've ruined everything. Do you know what you've done to Mom? To me?" "I know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I never wanted any of this to happen. Don't call me that. You left us. You left me." Her words cut deep, and I struggled to hold back tears. "Jenny, I love you. Please understand I had no choice. I hate you, Dad. You've ruined my life. I don't ever want to hear from you again." The line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, my heart shattered. My actions had caused my daughter unimaginable pain. The weight of her words pressed down on me, and I realized the full extent of the trauma I had inflicted on her. My anger and need for revenge had cost me my family. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. The fear of being caught was nothing compared to the anguish I felt at hearing Jenny's words. I had destroyed the one thing I had hoped to protect. One night, as I sat alone in a small, dimly lit bar, nursing a cold beer, a man approached me. He was tall, with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. He looked like he had seen his fair share of trouble. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, motioning to the empty seat across from me. He sat down and ordered a drink, studying me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "You look like a man who's seen some things," he said after a moment, his eyes never leaving mine. I shrugged, taking a sip of my beer. "We've all got our stories." He nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Indeed we do. What's yours?" I hesitated, the memories flooding back. "Just a man trying to leave his past behind." "Aren't we all?" he said, raising his glass in a silent toast. "Here's to new beginnings." We clinked glasses, and I forced a smile, though my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't afford to let my guard down, not even for a moment. The next day, I packed my few belongings and left town. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had recognized me, that he knew who I really was. I couldn't take any chances. As I traveled further south, I reflected on the choices that had led me here. I had acted out of anger and fear, but I had also done what I believed was necessary to protect my pride and serve justice. The guilt and regret would always be with me, but I had come to terms with my actions. I settled in a remote village near the coast, where the people were kind and the pace of life was slow. I found work as a fisherman, spending my days on the water and my nights under the stars. The simplicity of this life was a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind. Years passed, and I slowly healed. The physical labor made me strong, and the quiet moments of reflection allowed me to find peace. I still thought of Jenny every day, but the pain of our separation had dulled with time. I knew she was better off without me, and that thought gave me some comfort. One evening, as I sat on the beach watching the sunset, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I had found a new life, a new identity, and in that, I found a measure of redemption. The news reports eventually faded, and the world moved on. I was no longer Mark Davis, the fugitive. I was Carlos Alvarez, a man who had made mistakes but had also found a way to survive and heal. I had built a life here, one that was humble but fulfilling. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew that I could never fully escape my past, but I had found a way to live with it, and in that, I found strength. I stood up, brushed the sand off my clothes, and walked back to my small, weathered house. The future was uncertain, but I was ready to face whatever came my way. I had survived the darkest moments of my life and emerged stronger for it. And as I lay down to sleep that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The journey had been long and painful, but I had found my way. And in the end, that was all that mattered.